Boop, 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 boop. Okay, it's time for some flavor talk. Magic the Gathering has a lot of art. The art is what hooked me back in the day. I don't think some people think about this a lot, but for a kid in 1996, there wasn't a lot of places where you could see a lot of cool fantasy art. I used to wander the bookstore just to look at the covers of fantasy novels, or I'd stare at comic books. The first time I saw Magic cards, it was a greater variety of fantasy art at a higher level than I had ever seen before. You gotta remember, not a lot of people had internet at home. There was no ArtStation, there was no YouTube, there wasn't endless, amazing, high-quality art just being thrown around everywhere. So when I saw Magic cards, I was hooked. And I've had the chance to follow Magic for a while now and see its art change. People have talked a lot about the changes in the borders and the art direction, and sometimes people get hooked on old art. It's got something to it, but it's hard to say what it's got. Or people get hooked on some artists that feel just more magical to them. So let's dig into the MTG art for a minute, and let's talk about what makes it work. To talk about the art, I want to talk about game writing first. There's 3 voices that I know of for game writing. A voice is just a style of writing. There's the mechanical voice. That's just the actual numbers and mechanics of the game. That's the stat block in D&D. It talks to you like you're a person, in our world. It's the rules text on the card, or the numbers in the bottom right of a creature. Then there's writing about fantasy. That's the names of cards, or the flavor text. It's little descriptions of the world. It's almost more like a novel. Cards aren't named aggressive 2-drop for standard. They have names that reference the fantasy world. But again, it's talking to you like you're a person thinking about the fantasy world. The third voice is an immersive voice. It's like when a DM talks to you as the PC you're interacting with. It's when the little spark in MTG Arena talks to you as if you're a mage. This third voice assumes that you're in the magical world. I think game art has similar voices, and I'm going to try to break them down into 4. There's representational art, stylized art, out-of-world reference, and in-world reference. The representational art is the easiest to read and comprehend. It's rendered to have like a 3-dimensionality to it, a depth. It's all the principles of Renaissance painting, with all the tech available in the 21st century, both analog and digital. I think this style of art is a response sort of to the limits of the early game. On the earlier cards, sometimes I feel like I can see the deadlines and the budget limitations on them. They were clearly made with love, but it seems like there wasn't always a budget or tools to really lavish attention on any image. Some of the older art even feels cartoonish. Around Mirage, there's a shift where art on the whole gets more vivid, more refined, more serious. The entire set starts to feel like a world we can step into. This art treats the frame as a little window into the world of magic. Things are depicted in a way that's pretty concrete. Magic appears often like a force field, or a flow, or flames. We can see the edges of it. We can see very clearly where it is in space. The benefits of this voice is that it's immediate. When you look at it, you can tell what's happening. Nothing is unclear. But that strength is also the weakness. When I look at this, the magic doesn't feel magical. It feels somehow plain. The arcane isn't arcane, it's mundane. So one way to reinfuse some mystery into magic is to make those images more, arcane, more mysterious. To do that, the artist takes a step away from clarity. They start to stylize and abstract the imagery. Shading adds a 3-dimensionality to the work. Abstraction adds yet another dimension by trying to communicate more than the eye can see. Instead of showing us what magic might really look like, abstraction shows us how magic might warp our perception. Magic warps reality, so let's show it warping our perceptions too. There are little ways for this to happen, like on Anja Falkenrath. There's a blur to the image. It has a sort of cryptid vibe to it that shows us more because it's not clear. But some artists push the stylization and abstraction further by acknowledging the medium. In representational work, the artist transcends the medium. They don't want you to see the paint, they want you to see the image. To just see the depth, the 3D space and form. Sometimes in more stylized art, the artist establishes 3D space and then breaks it again, using colors that are very flat or brushstrokes that are very visible to acknowledge that this is a painting. It's 2-dimensional. There's a 3D image here happening on a 2D plane. They make 3D space in the image and then they tear it apart with 2-dimensional markings. The 2D markings break the 3D space the same way that magic would break 3D space. You can see this really beautifully in the work of Nils Hamm and Richard Kane Ferguson. Their work establishes 2 worlds within itself. There are areas where the imagery is clear and concrete, and there are areas where things dissolve into pure mark-making. Just fields of color and light, the absence of form. In this image for Baleful Strix, we can tell there's a bird, but it's almost just the shadow of a bird. And the regions around the bird are foggy. Not like a literal mist of water, they're foggy to our perception. It's not that there's a fog hiding something, it's that there's a kind of fog where I can't even understand what the fog itself is. With Richard Kane Ferguson, there are these areas of his art that are very concrete, very clear. An arm here, a head there, and then around it is all these swirls, not just of energy, but swirls of paint. Or look at this art from Mindbend. It's so gestural. We can tell there's a head, and some colors, and a hand hidden in there, but that's all we get. The art doesn't show us everything that's happening. We have to connect some dots to understand what the image is depicting. It's mysterious. Other artists play with the flatness of the work in a different way. Artists like Rebecca Gay, Scott Kirshner, and Robert Bliss have a stylization to them that makes their work just a little stranger than others. Gay's work seems to float. Everything happens in a haze of magic where the gravity is at like 50%. She uses hard outlines to break the image up into 2D space, even as she renders the forms with depth. Robert Bliss gives himself a leeway with forms that's really alien. He doesn't use glowing energy, he uses fantastical shapes to let you know the world you're looking at is not our world. Scott Kirshner's images are kind of two-dimensional, like a bas-relief. They remind me of iconography, simplified for impact. In all of abstraction, there's this kind of distance. Representation says, with enough attention and work, we can show you exactly what happened. Abstraction says, you can never see what happened because it's magic, but I can make an image that helps you imagine and feel what happened. I can talk to you about what happened. Abstract art is one step removed from magic because it doesn't try to show you a photo, but it's also one step more direct because you can only imagine magic in your mind. Representation only gets in the way. One thing you might have noticed is I'm talking about a lot of older artists. In the older art, there's a mix of works. Some are more limited by technology or budget. Some of the art looks abbreviated because it was being done for $50 cash and $50 stock. Given that budget, each one of these paintings is a masterpiece. And right along in there are works by some of the most timeless MTG artists ever. I think that in the later 90s and 2000s, games were reacting to a sort of shame. They were getting budgets that they hadn't had before. They wanted to look more legit. For a lot of games, that meant more realistic. So we saw a shift away from the more cartoony work of earlier cards to more realistic, refined work. The stylization also seems to tone down too, though. We'll come back to this, but for now, let's return to the voices in art. A lot of art uses reference. In Magic the Gathering, things either refer in or they refer out. Back in the day, when Magic was starting, it made a lot of out-of-world references. Flavor text was poetry from our world. That lent Magic a gravity that it didn't always have on its own. There was also plenty of reference in the art. Every here and there you'll find a card like Demonic Attorney. The demons here look pretty specifically English and pretty specifically 18th, 19th century from our world. Most fantasy is derived from our world in one way or another, but some specific references are so specific, or break so far from the rest of the fantasy world they're in, that they feel anachronistic. They remind us that we're playing a game in our world. They point towards things outside of the game. We're not really wizards casting spells. We're playing a game talking about wizards casting spells. Making out-of-world references in MTG is a kind of metagame humor. Little Easter eggs for players, like how Buffy and Angel were on cards together. Or alters that people make for their own jokes. As the relationship of Magic the Gathering to its players and to other franchises has changed, it's become more comfortable again, making jokes to players and referencing other worlds. This always tends to shock the old guard. Secret layers like The Walking Dead or Godzilla made specific and overt reference to worlds that are supposedly outside of the Blind Eternities. With sets like the new Kamigawa, we saw a lot of references in main set cards like the Ninja Turtle and Master Splinter. This isn't just a reference to Japanese culture or history, it's a reference to specific 20th century media characters and IP. There were alternate art cards done in anime styles too. Again, Magic has referenced our world since it started, but some references seem to rub Old Guard players the wrong way, while others are accepted. One line seems to be the age of the thing being referenced. Referencing books, myths, and ancient history seems to lend gravitas to the game, make it heavier, more serious. Referencing the distant past seems almost fantastical enough to not break people's immersion. Referencing pop culture, TV, internet, comics, Mass-produced media since the 1900s seems to pretty dependably get somebody to say, this isn't magic. To me, it feels like wanting to look at your fantasy world without the fantasy world looking back at you. I know it's the 21st century and the internet exists, but I go to fantasy to be somewhere else, and I don't want my fantasy world to acknowledge that the 21st century internet exists. This brings us to our fourth voice, in-world reference. This voice refers us to things in the world of Magic the Gathering that refer to other things in the world of Magic. We're not illustrating the world of Magic here, we're illustrating the way people in the world of Magic would illustrate the world. This is most clearly seen in the sagas. The art for these cards always shows objects. They're paintings of other forms of art, mosaics, sketches, flower arrangements. They're kind of meta art. They build the world of Magic not by showing us magical events, but by showing us how people in the world commemorate the events. These are some of the most complex artworks in all of Magic. They require stylization skill to replicate another art tradition. They also require enough realism skill to communicate the materials that these artworks are being portrayed on. But now that I think of it, there's kind of a fifth voice. Even in the in-world reference voice, the card is seen as a window into the world of Magic. But the cards aren't supposed to be windows. They're supposed to be spells. Our deck is our library. These cards aren't supposed to be about magic, they are magic. This is where frame treatment comes in. The contemporary frame is very legible, but it's mostly utilitarian. It's about legibility and clarity. But when you compare it to the old borders, it looks kind of computery. The old borders are what's called skeuomorphic. They're painted illusionistically to look like materials. Stone, wood, ooze. Everything inside the black border is just a little bit in-world. In the new borders, it's accepted that the Magic card isn't in-world. Everything in the art is responsible for telling us about the world. But in recent years, we're seeing Magic recover some of its lost skeuomorphic design. The Mystical Archive cards look like diagrams a wizard might draw in an illuminated manuscript to describe spellcraft for other mages. And the frame of these cards helps push that theme. The knotwork of Kaldheim works with the woodcut look of the art to make a card that feels like it's got one foot in another world. Some secret layers, like the Mischief secret layers, used minimal metallic designs to make cards that really look like occult objects. One of the hardest pushes into this design space are the Phyrexian script Praetors. They don't just have an immersive frame, they have an immersive language. After all, why would people from the Blind Eternities speak Earth languages? If I could change one thing on these, it would have been the illustrations, to make them approximate in-world Phyrexian art. I'd love to see what art is on the wall in a Church of Yawgmoth. I like when the cards feel like, for lack of a better term, artifacts from another world. Little bits of a fantasy world that made it through the cracks in the Blind Eternities into my hands. But this makes me think of another thing. The old art now feels old. It didn't feel old in the 90s. But now when I see it, I can feel its age. The past is inaccessible, almost like the Blind Eternities are. I can't travel there. The old art has unintentionally developed an identity, not about representation or abstraction, not about reference to other media or the world of Magic the Gathering. It's some kind of reference to itself, to its own history. How can an art style refer to itself? Well, the only real example I can think of is the namesake for this channel, Commanding Presence. It's by this guy. I remember when this card came out, people were really hard on it. The artist doesn't even seem to put it up on his portfolio. Some even questioned his abilities. But to me, it looks like old school MTG art. It's got this hardcore 90s fantasy art vibe that I think was maybe too accurate for some players. If you look at his work, he doesn't always go this 90s, but 90s fantasy art is its own look. As Magic continues to develop, I'm really excited to see the growing appetite for in-world art. From the sagas to the amazing full art lands of Kamigawa and New Capenna, they look like paintings transported from the worlds we're enjoying. At the same time, they're pulling from their own history. Old border cards feel like art objects transported from a past that never was. I mean, the old border stopped before Thoughtseize ever got printed. Well, I don't know how to end this, so I'm just going to leave you with my favorite art of all. Please take this time to like, comment, and subscribe. And think about how you don't deserve an untap step. In fact, you probably didn't need one in the first place. Yeah, things look better sideways.